Okay, good evening, John. We are having fun today getting some family history from my older brother, John. So, why don't we start from the top? Uh, where were you born?
I was born in Iowa Lutheran Hospital. Well, mom and dad were living in Dallas Center, Iowa, which is now a bedroom community of Des Moines,
Uh-huh.
metro area.
Okay. And so, for those of us out here wanting to get you a birthday card ready, what was that date?
21st July 1950.
There you go. Now, Grandpa Rhett passed before you were born,
Yes, he died a month to the day before I was born.
but he knew you were coming.
Yes, he knew I was coming. I would have been his first Rutt grandchild in Iowa.
Oh, sure. Because Eleanor and Marion.
Eleanor and Marion already had children. But
And so and for those of us watching who might not know, but when we talk about Eleanor and Marion, who are they?
they were Dad's older sisters. I didn't realize until later that their mother was different from our grandma, Lois Rutt. But as far as Dad was concerned, they were his sisters. They weren't his half-sisters, or they weren't adopted. They were his sisters.
So now, as I understand it, Marion was older?
Yes, I think Marion was a little bit older than Eleanor.
Yeah, okay. And so as far as we know, we don't know what happened to the first Mrs. Rutt, Grandpa Rutt's first wife.
She died suddenly, and Granddad Rutt had been a one-room school teacher out in Utah, and then had gone into Presbyterian Cemetery because he had been raised a Mennonite. His father was a Pennsylvania Dutch farmer in upstate New York.
I did not know that.
And Granddad Clinton, our Granddad Clinton, Raymond Jacob Clinton wanted to join the larger denomination, so he became a Presbyterian.
Yeah, so Raymond Jacob Rutt.
Yes, was our granddad.
Okay, so he was actually a Mennonite
Pennsylvania Dutch farm boy. Yes.
Who was a one-room school teacher in Utah.
Yes.
And so he goes to seminary, do we know where?
I don't know where. I've heard our grandma Lois Rutt say where, but I don't remember where that is.
Okay.
The interesting thing about our great-grandfather Rutt, the farmer, was there's two family stories about him. One, on Sunday they'd gone to Mennonite services, and a woman had stood up and made a public confession of sin. And our grandma Lois Rutt, who was a new wife with her mother-in-law, tried to put pressure on our great-granddad Rutt of what the sin was. And all he'd say is, that's between she and God, and that's all.
Oh dear, so Grandma Lois Rutt, she wanted the facts.
That's right. But that's as much as her father-in-law would say. And when our great-granddad Rutt was taking our grandfather Rutt, Raymond Jacob, to catch the train to go to seminary, he said, you know, Raymond, if I had my life to live over again, I'd be a farmer the second time.
Oh, so that's our Grandpa Rutt?
Our great-granddad Rutt.
Our great-granddad Rutt.
Yes.
And he said that because why?
Because our grandfather Rutt decided that he had a call into the ministry, and he needed to go to seminary to get that taken care of. I can remember my dad telling us that in the seminary it was a 3-year program. You were a freshman, you were a middler, and then you were a senior. And that's kind of the way they did things back then.
Okay, so the statement you said earlier that he told, so our Grandpa Rutt told his dad?
Our great-granddad Rutt told our grandfather Rutt,
yes,
that if he had his life to live over again, he'd be a farmer the second time round.
Because so he wasn't a farmer? I thought you said he was a farmer.
Our great-granddad Rutt was a farmer.
Uh-huh.
And our grandfather Rutt, Raymond Jacob, was raised on a farm.
Raised on a farm.
But he decided that he wanted to go into teaching, and was a one-room school teacher in Utah for a while, and then decided to go to seminary.
So why did our great-grandpa Rutt say that he'd be a farmer the second time? Why, wasn't he a farmer the first time?
He was a farmer the first time, but he said if I had my life to live over again, I'd still be a farmer.
Oh, so he was just basically saying that he understood that his son wanted to be just something different, but but if he had to do it over again, he'd still be a farmer.
That's right. That's
I
what our
see.
great granddad
I
would say.
thought maybe there's some reason he didn't like being a farmer or something.
No, I don't think so.
and now-
no, there's a third family story. I heard this from our grandma Lois Rutt,
Right.
our grandmother Rutt.
Sure.
She said that her father-in-law's favorite food. This was all back when farming was done by hand and with great draft horses
Sure.
and things like that.
Right.
And he got up at 5 and would have breakfast at about 7.
Okay.
And his favorite thing for breakfast was pie with hot gravy over it.
Any sort of pie?
That's, of course, if you stop to think, he'd been working 2 hours before he even had breakfast.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no.
So he needed a lot of energy just to keep going.
Yeah, no. In talking to this farmer I used to visit in Spencer, that's the way he farmed too in the beginning too. And yeah, he said there was just a certain routine that about 8 or 9 o'clock you would stop and have coffee. But when you have coffee, you always had something with coffee.
I see.
And so that was the wife's job, was to make sure. In talking to his wife, she said she'd always have to have something ready to go, to go along with that coffee, whether it's a cookies or pastry or a cake or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
interesting.
It was interesting. There was another story about our granddad, Rhett, when he was out there. There was one of his students didn't do a very good job on something, and our granddad,
Right.
was shaking this girl, and he shook her so hard that the bobby pins fell out of her hair.
Oh dear.
And the last thing about our granddad, when he was out there, he stayed with different families because that's the way you worked if you were a one-room country school teacher. And there was one family, a nice family of Mormons, that tried to get him interested in the church, and he'd read some books about the Mormon church and decided that is what he wanted to do. He thanked them, and they were very good people, but he decided he wanted to stay a minister. I can remember hearing Dad and Grandma Rutt, or Grandma Lois Rutt, and Eleanor and Marion talk, but mostly our grandmother Lois Rutt, talking about the fact that he had studied classical Latin and New Testament Greek, and he could read both. And I had a hard time understanding how a person who could understand classical Greek and New Testament Greek, Koine, would end up being a fundamentalist. And so I asked my father, I said, was your dad a fundamentalist? And he smiled and he said, yes. About 1922, there was a series of little small books that came out that were called Fundamentals of Christianity. And that's where the term for fundamentalist came from, all those little books. And Granddad Rutt went along with those ideas. He felt that was an appropriate thing to do.
Wow. So now, do we think he taught Greek and Latin in his school, or?
I think he just used that for his personal
Okay, because I know
study.
sometimes they did teach Latin in
Yes.
beginning schools.
Yeah, they did. They used to in some of the beginning
Yeah.
schools.
Okay. Well, since we're on the subject of Granddad Rutt, that's a lot of stuff about Granddad Rutt I never knew. So that's really good stuff. So when we're on the subject of Grandpa Rutt, so I also know that lots of times in the summer we would go down to Clarence and
Florence.
Florence's. Okay, so explain who are Clarence and Florence in our family.
Well, in our family, we called them Aunt Florence and Uncle Clarence. It didn't dawn on me till quite a bit later that they were actually our great Aunt Florence and our great Uncle Clarence.
Because they're actually aunt and uncle to our dad.
Yes, and so see, they would have been our great
Okay.
great aunt, and great uncle Florence and Clarence.
Okay.
But we didn't call them that. We just called them Aunt Florence and Uncle Clarence.
And
Uncle Clarence was a very quiet person. Florence did a lot of the talking in that family.
And
I can remember Dad telling us one time after we made a visit that she had taught her daughter, it would have been our second cousin, Virginia, how to play piano. And when she went off to school in California, she didn't have to relearn anything because her mother had taught her how to play the piano so well. Now, this is just my idea. I don't know if it's true or not, but this was another situation, kind of like our Granddad Rutt, where Clarence's wife had died early and left him with a child, and he needed a wife to run the house and take care of stuff like that. And they never had any children. Now, this might just be me. I don't know if they ever had sex or not. It's hard telling. But I don't think it was that important back then. They had a spiritual bond of their souls, and they were committed one to the other. And they really were like, we kids, when we make a visit like that, one time on the way home from that visit, I said to Mom, Mother, why didn't you talk about all the other relatives the way they did? And she smiled and said, because they'll probably be talking the same thing about us now that we're not there. One time we were taking a trip somewhere in the back roads back there, and we came to a covered bridge, and we asked Mom and Dad if we could put our initials on the bridge. And Mom or Dad, one or the other, said, fools' names and fools' places always are in public places.
Oh, I never
So
heard
we
that one
couldn't do
before.
that.
Okay. So now the connection to our family through Clarence and Florence, if I get this right, Florence is a sister of Grandma Lois?
She was the oldest sister of our Grandma Lois Rutt.
Okay. And I know she had another sister.
Yes, the baby sister in the family was Aunt Francina.
Aunt
who We
Francina.
called Aunt Francina. She and their husband Tom was a very quiet man. He was a farmer. He'd been the mayor out in Yorktown, which is about 35 miles south and west from Clarinda, down there.
Because Clarinda is where Clarence and Florence live.
Yes,
Where they
they
lived.
did. After they retired from the active ministry, they retired there.
And now he was a Methodist or a Presbyterian pastor?
He was a Methodist minister. He did not have enough money to go to seminary like some of his brother preachers did. But back then you could read a series of books, and then they would pass an exam with your bishop, and he would ordain you.
Oh.
And that's how, when Clarence was going through that, Florence read the books too. And that was another family story. One time, Uncle Clarence was so sick he couldn't preach the sermon. And so Florence stepped right in and ran the service, including giving the sermon.
I did not hear that
This was a
before.
long time ago, and even before they allowed women to be ministers in the Methodist Church. And that was quite something.
Well, that's-
One time we were coming back, and one of us kids, myself the oldest, Dave the middle child, and second son, and Sue the middle child, one of us said, Uncle Florence and Aunt Clarence. And then we would, whoops, it's the other way around, and then we all laughed.
That's right. Easy to get them confused.
Yeah.
So, and want to go back to one other point you said. So, Florence was Clarence's second wife,
That's right, yes.
and what was their daughter's name?
Virginia.
And Virginia is Clarence's
Daughter. Yes.
from his first marriage.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so that was the only child they had.
I think that was the only child they had, yes.
I do remember you talking about. So now, do we know who Virginia's children were?
She and her husband, what was Virginia's husband's name?
See, because I can remember Mom talking about Virginia, and I wasn't always sure about the connections there.
Yeah. I think they ended up calling her Virginia because that was where Clarence was from originally, was Virginia.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And relocated to Iowa and became a minister out here.
Okay.
Now, I could have got that wrong because it's very possible that they were just, that Virginia was Clarence's and Florence's daughter, but I'm pretty sure that was from his first wife. And it's kind of the same circumstances, the way our grandfather
Right,
Rutt
with Lois.
and our Grandma Lois Rutt
Right.
got married because Granddad Raymond Jacob Rutt's first wife had died suddenly, and he had two little girls, and he needed someone to raise the two little girls, and our Grandma Lois Rutt was singing as an evangelical church worker. She studied voice with one of the teachers in Clarinda, and she had been on, and she said to Grandma Rutt one time, "Oh kid, if we could go on the road, you'd be a smash." And Grandmother Lois told me that, and that's how she met her husband to be. She'd been invited to come to be the church worker for a revival in Granddad Rutt's church, and that's how they became acquainted. And then I think it was Clarence and our Granddad Rutt that would quite often come over courting which they don't do much now.
Right.
But
So do
that's
we-
how you got to know your
Sure.
future wife. And there'd always be a chaperone from the family there
Sure.
to be sure that everything was above board.
So do we know where this happened at?
Pardon me?
Do we know where Grandpa Rutt met Grandma Lois?
It was at that church of his that he was having a revival for the community.
But we don't know where that community was.
No, I don't know which church that was
Okay.
in.
Okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know how they met. That was one of my questions. And I wanted to go back to an earlier thing.
Sure.
I had you say where you were born, and I think I know the answer to this one. But how did you get your name?
I got my name because originally there was a little child that was born before me when mom and dad first starting their marriage, and something was internally wrong with the child. It only lived the day it was born, and then she was cremated, and mom said there was this little zinc cube on top of the refrigerator until school was out. Dad was teaching band at Dallas Center Consolidated Schools, and mom was raising a family. And after school's out, they and dad and our grandma Rutt, drove down to the cemetery out from Yorktown, and our dad took a shovel along and buried there. And the little girl's name would have been Barbara Jean, and I came after her. And I remember, maybe I got it confused, because sometimes as a little child you get things confused. I was under the impression that if I had been a girl, they were going to call me Barbara, and instead I was a boy, and so they took the first name of both grandfathers. My maternal grandfather, June's father's first name was John, and my paternal grandfather, our dad's father's, name was Raymond, and so that's how they put there to get my name, John Raymond Rutt.
Oh, see, now that's not the way I thought it went. But okay,
Yeah.
So then the Barbara you're talking about was actually their first child?
Was actually the first child, but something was seriously wrong.
So no, was there?
internally, and she didn't, after she was born, she didn't even live for a day and night.
See, now I thought there was a child that came after you and David. No?
I don't think so. The only other child that died was Mary
Mary
Beth,
Beth.
and that's quite a bit along.
And that's
further.
after me.
Yeah, after you. Yep.
Oh, see, I had that confused then. So Barbara was actually. Oh, and that could be the case because they were married in 48.
They were married in 1948.
So they
yes.
could have had a child after that
Yes.
and then done again.
Yep.
So, and do we know where Barbara is buried at?
Yes, she's buried on top of our grandfather, Raymond Jacob Rutt's cemetery plot at Pleasant View, outside of Yorktown.
Yorktown.
Yes.
Because there
was a plot there where Granddad's Raymond Jacob Rutt's
Sure.
body was buried, and then they just buried Barbara Jean's remains on top there.
So, and Grandma Lois Rutt, her maiden name was Castle.
Yes, her maiden name was Castle.
So are there a bunch of castles buried in Yorktown, do we think?
That I don't know. I'm not for sure where Lois and where Francina ended up being buried, or where Aunt Florence ended up being buried.
Well, you'd think if Tom and Francina were in Yorktown, they would have been buried in Yorktown.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? I think
And
that.
I'm
that
trying to
prob-
remember where, because I remember, of course, having Grandma Rutt's funeral down there. Do we think she was buried in Yorktown?
Yes, she was buried there. Grandma told me at one time that her husband, my granddad Raymond Rutt, had asked her to please be sure that when I die that I'm buried in Nebraska, because I think that was where he had family connections with.
Oh.
And she said, "I'm sorry, Raymond, I couldn't do that because if I buried you in Nebraska, I never would have been able to get to your grave."
Oh.
And that's why Granddad Raymond Jacob Rutt was buried at Pleasant Hill Cemetery in outside of Yorktown.
We'll have to go. I don't know that I remember going to that place.
Yeah.
You
I
think-
only remember going once. She said it's easy to find your grandfather's cemetery plot. There's this big stone thing with a stone sphere carved out of granite, and if you just go a little to the left, you could see that's where Raymond Jacob, and then also his wife. I don't know where his first wife was buried, but his second wife, our grandma Lois Rutt,
Would be buried.
was buried
Yeah.
out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
we can go two ways here at this point, John. You can keep talking about grandma and grandpa's, or you can talk about your childhood. What do you feel good about?
Well, that's interesting.
Because we've kind of covered the Rut and Castle side, I think.
Yes, we did.
Do we know how many sisters there were? There's three sisters of
I think
Francina?
originally there was something like 13 children, but only
Three girls.
three of them. At least when I was little, there was just Florence, who was the oldest.
Right.
Our grandma Lois
Lois.
Rudd, who was kind of the middle child, and then grandma or great aunt Francina, who was
Okay.
lived.
Okay.
Before
And do we
us.
know if Grandpa Rutt had any brothers or sisters?
Yes, that dawned on me years later. I knew about Bob and Hester. They used to come and visit us a lot.
Okay, so
and we
what's-
even went with them to visit their house.
In
This was
Minnesota.
back before they had any kind of treatment for allergies and stuff. And Bob Roberts was his name, but I think that's why everybody called him Uncle Bob, because his last name was Roberts. Was a pharmacist, and in the summer he'd get these awful attacks of allergy, and his doctor said, "Start driving north, and when you get far enough outside of this thing, you'll be able to breathe better, and build a house, a summer cabin there." And so they had that. We went to visit them the day before my birthday, the year that they made the moonwalk,
Yeah, 1969.
1969.
Yeah, I
Yes.
remember that.
That's before I would have been 19.
Because I think they had a really small little TV, so we could kind of
Yes.
see it.
I always thought that was kind of unusual. Dad said he went camping to get away from the city, and then he took a television set to take the whole city with him.
Well, a little bit there.
But
Okay.
that's something he liked
So,
to do.
so Bob was a brother of Grandpa Rutt?
Bob's wife, she wasn't aunt, she was
Hester.
Hester. She would have been granddad's, would have been our father's aunt.
Aunt. So he'd
So
be
she was Raymond Jacob Rutt's sister.
So Hester was the connection there.
Hester was a family
See,
connection.
I never was sure if it was Bob was the connection or Hester was the connection.
Hester was the
Okay.
connection.
I'm going to take a
Yeah.
quick break here, John. Hold on.